Mikey Lynch, welcome to the Upside Down People podcast. How are you going today?
Doing all right, thank you. Yeah, how about yourself?
Yeah, doing all right. I'm here in sunny Perth. It's been a fairly warm week. Whereabouts are you? You're in Tassie?
Yeah, but what you mean by warm and what I mean by warm are quite different things.
Yeah. What's your parameters for warm?
So today is a warm day for this time of year for Hobart, and I think we would have been lucky if we'd hit 25 degrees, and something like that. And then it's looking like we're going to sort of drop down in temperature tomorrow to 20, the day after 16 as a high.
Yeah, wow.
We do get up into the low 30s on occasion.
Yeah.
Consistently, whereas what you mean by hot, I imagine, is happening in the 30s.
It is. So yesterday was a fairly warm day. It was around 39 degrees. So today's a bit cooler. It's a pleasant 30 degrees, but it is more humid. So yeah, very different ideas of what warm is. How
That's right, yes.
Been in Tassie for?
I'm a Tasmanian, so I was born in Tasmania, and lived here most of my life. Yeah, as I was growing up, my family cycled around the southeastern states. So I spent some time in Adelaide in primary school and Melbourne for a large proportion of high school. But I've been back since the very end of high school, university, whole ministry, work life has been Tasmania. Yep.
Awesome. Well, I thought a good place to start would be to get to know you a bit. So maybe share with our listeners a bit about who you are, what you do, what you're involved in, and even some hobbies that you might enjoy in your time off.
Oh, yeah. In terms of the things I get paid for during the week, I work for AFES, University Student Ministry. So I lead the staff team at the Hobart campuses of the University of Tasmania. I've been doing that for maybe 14 years or something now, so quite some time. And I was involved in that group as a student and a young convert and so on back in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So I work for AFES and then also work a day and a half a week for the Gospel Coalition Australia. Just started that this year as the website editorial director, dealing with all the articles that come in for Gospel Coalition. So, look, I'm a writer too, so I've only published a couple of books, but that takes time and energy and then effort to kind of make sure that you raise awareness of what you've written and prepare for new things. So I wrote The Good Life in the Last Days and published that with Matthias Media in 2018, and then just this year, The Vine Movement in 2023. So that's another kind of area of focus in terms of ministry life and work and the chicken feed of income that comes for your average author. But then I have always been involved in a range of other different ministries in an unpaid capacity. At the moment, that includes being on the board for Reach Australia, which started as a church planting network and has broadened out from there, and New Front Door, which is a Christian ministry that supports churches with their IT needs, like website, best practice with that kind of thing. So I've been the founder and chairman of that for however long that's existed now, as well. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. So that keeps you pretty busy, I imagine, trying to juggle those balls at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, different phases of life have different degrees of complexity and busyness, and certainly leading into and since the pandemic and all that kind of stuff, I've actually cut back on other things and made some lifestyle shifts to be, more present with a few things rather than serving on multiple things. So it's less than it has been in the past, actually.
And tell us a bit about your family life and some things you get up to when you're not working.
Yeah, I'm married with 3 kids, 18-year-old, 16-year-old, and a 13-year-old. Yeah. I'm a keen rollerblader, inline skater. So the Hobart weather isn't the best for that. When it rains, it makes it we don't have any indoor skate parks here, so you need the weather to hit up the park or the ramp. So and and keen reader and film watcher. So like reading like literature and watching films and talk about films and that kind of
Do you
stuff.
have a particular favorite author?
Oh, I'm a big fan of what's called literary modernism, just of the early 20th century kind of experimental literature. So James Joyce is I'm a huge fan of James Joyce, but Virginia Woolf. I'm just at the moment just started reading Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, which is this sort of novel in 7 parts, gigantic thing, and really loving that. So that's my wheelhouse.
Nice, fascinating.
Are you a reader?
I've gradually become more of a reader. I wouldn't say I ever saw myself like going through school. I probably I read the like summary or plot line of books on Wikipedia or something like that, and then would do the presentations in class. And then only after school I started actually enjoying reading as a way of just decluttering and slowing down and actually getting into something I enjoy. So I'm starting to read more. Yeah. But in terms of the literary modernism, is that what you're into? I haven't dived too deeply into there yet.
Yeah, okay. One day. Maybe one day.
One day, that's it. Another question I love asking our guests, just to get to know them a bit more and add some flesh to who they are or the voice that our listeners may be hearing, is what's a high and a low that you've experienced in your journey of career, work, personal life?
High or low? Well, I mean, I could say this, that in a weird way, both the high and a low was the whole early years of becoming a Christian and getting into ministry. It was a high because it was something of a little bit of a revival that took place down here in a local church and in the campus ministry kind of combined. And so myself and a bunch of, people, some of whom are still now ministers and, heavily involved in the leadership of churches here in Tasmania. A whole bunch of us became Christians and then got really active and keen in ministry, and a whole lot of people ended up, going off and training at theological college, all that kind of stuff. That was a very exciting time in the late 90s, early 2000s. It did feel like if you could just get somebody to church or to read the Bible, they'd become a Christian. There was a lot of people from very different, that was the kind of like 1990s was when a hot house of a certain kind of alternative grunge, post-Nirvana, that kind of world. And so there was that kind of cultural world, some of them coming to faith, as well as, people growing up in church, really kind of owning their faith in a very serious way. That was very exciting. And out of that, a new church got started, then started another church that was involved in starting other churches. And so there's a lot of really fond memories and a real sense of excitement around that time. And you know what? It's weird that as you look back on it, you go, the very same time also involved a whole lot of lows, because people are sinful. Young people with all their zeal are foolish and sinful. And so at the same moment that the Spirit is at work, he's also at work through foolish, short-sighted, self-absorbed, young people. And so it's an interesting thing looking back and going, that's some of the best times of your life, but also you go, there were unhealthy dynamics there. There was various kinds of judgmentalism or poor treatment of people or poor managing of power, or as well as then just the sadness of people burning out, falling away, that you think back at the number of people who professed faith back then, and then as the years and the decades have gone on, the number of those who in one way or another have either been hit with terrible tragedies or sufferings or been really damaged by sin or sickness. And some of them just unbelief, have just walked away from the faith entirely. So, it's really important not to have rose-coloured glasses. And the same is true, like if you study Reformation history, extraordinary what God did in the Protestant Reformation or Reformations. Almost as soon as it began, it became weird and complicated and spoiled by ego, tangled up in politics, People were being killed for heresy, and the Protestant movement just divided over relatively minor doctrinal points. And even great heroes like Martin Luther penned appalling anti-Semitic tracts. And so, the Reformation gave rise to a new, the first round of nutty, crazy, end of the world cults.
Right. Yeah.
So I guess it's whenever you've got heroes and whenever you've got a work of God, the devil's prowling around, and there's a whole other story at exactly the same moment. So there you go. That's a high and a low all in one.
That's brilliant. Thanks so much. And got a bit of a history lesson there as well, which is awesome.
Yeah.
So much, good and sort of, I don't know. I could say evil did come out of the Reformation. Just thinking of like the printing press, for example, it's like a brilliant tool that allowed the gospel to be shared far and wide and understood as well. But then you have like the ramifications of that with even now social media addictions or pornography, or like there's all these different impacts from that. So I get what you're saying is like Satan will be prowling, trying to see what he can use to turn. Which is a good point. You mentioned your recent book, The Vine Movement, which is do you mind giving us a bit of a snapshot into what that book is about and why you wrote it?
Yeah, happily. So the Vine Movement looks at the question of how church life and ministry and structures and leadership, how does that relate to all the other kinds of Christian ministry and activity that's not directly and explicitly the church? That usually gets called Parachurch, all the other Christian things. So you're hosting a podcast right now. That's a Parachurch. It's a Christian activity. It's not your Sunday service. It's not run by your minister and overseen by your elders, I presume. And so looking at that, how do those two things relate together? How can they positively reinforce and cooperate well? How can the church as God's ordained structure through which his gospel is to be preached and his people matured, how's that to be honoured in a way that doesn't stifle the other ways in which God is at work through his people in the world? So it's looking at that question, looks at theologically, gives general practical advice for both sides of it, in a sense, looking at, what advice is there for the church leaders, denominational leaders, what advice is there for parachurch leaders of various kinds. And then the back end of the book looks at a whole bunch of case studies, chaplaincy, cross-cultural mission, Christian publishing, theological education, religious orders, all that kind of stuff, and looks at history and some of the practical issues related to all that kind of different sort of stuff. So that's what the book is, and I wrote it. I mean, both the books I've written, I wrote because I didn't think the books existed, and I wanted to read them. I thought they were needed. So the best of my knowledge still, although I think IVP is on the brink of publishing something, but to date, there's nothing really comprehensive and up to date on church and parachurch. There was something pretty good written in the 1990s, something pretty good written in the early 1980s, but both of them were much shorter books, around 200 pages, and so weren't able to cover a whole lot of ground. And so I just thought we needed something that really got deep into theology, as well as deep into the practice, as well as deep into the history, kind of a one-stop shop. And so I gave it my best go, and something's better than nothing. That's why I wrote it.
Awesome. So what is the difference then between something, you sort of explained it a bit about the local church and then something of the parachurch. How would you define the two within our Western context?
Which I would begin, first of all, by talking about the universal church. That's a really important and helpful starting point to say neither church nor parachurch are the most fundamental thing. The most fundamental thing is those God has chosen before the beginning of time, bought with his blood, forward with the preaching of the gospel, gathered, not just on Sunday for singing and praying and preaching, but gathered around Christ, to be raised with him for all eternity, worshipping him, renewed and glorified. So that's the most foundational reality. And to belong to that, to be a prophet and priest and king in Christ, is the most foundational status a Christian can have, way more than minister or bishop or something. So beginning there, but then how that is expressed on earth in these last days. My definition of the local church is that it's a formal community of Christians who gather for various purposes, preaching and prayer and loving one another, building up, evangelism, that kind of thing. And then Parachurch, I think it is more useful to have a very broad definition and to say a Parachurch is any formal Christian ministry beyond the earthly institutional church.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it may be denominationally affiliated or non-denominational. It may have a formal constitution, or it may just be a kind of in a sense, I don't know the details of your podcast, but your podcast may be very informal, doesn't have an ABN, doesn't have a mission statement written down, perhaps, who knows. But it's still formal insofar as you've deliberately said, I'm going to do a podcast and I'm going to, chip away at it regularly. It's a thing,
Yeah.
So anything that's a thing that has a Christian motivation of some kind, and is deliberately self-consciously Christian, but isn't, and is in some way distinct from the earthly institutional church, is a parachurch. That's how I go for those two. It's just very broad, and you need to, because there's so many different ways Christians get up to stuff.
Yeah.
That a too narrow definition leaves out too much. Yeah.
No, I agree. So then that brings up the question of importance. So is there a priority over one or the other? Or is there a need for one over the other? Or is there something where they both need to coexist?
Yeah, at extremes, there are some people who say there's no such thing as parachurches, by which they mean every Christian ministry, in a sense, is the church. And so a missions society, a campus group, is just as much church as a local church meeting on Sunday with ministers and elders and discipline and membership and so on. It's one extreme, and I don't think that's right. I think that's in trying to honour the good things Christians do beyond the local church. I think it stretches definitions and distorts them. So that's one extreme. Another extreme are people who say there shouldn't be such a thing as a parachurch, and everything should be run by the local church. Parachurches exist, but they shouldn't exist. If there's going to be a podcast, it should be under the eldership of the church, facilitated and weighed and disciplined by them and so on. So they're kind of two extremes. I don't agree with either. I think there is a conceptual thing that is the local church, and that a lot of the other things Christians do aren't some other version of the local version of church or some other sodality of church or something. So it's possible to have a kind of Christian activity that's not church, is what I think. But I do agree with the person who says there shouldn't be such a thing as a parachurch. I agree with them insofar as I agree that the local church does have a particular priority on earth in the way God's people should go about being God's people.
Right.
And so the other things we do should have deference to, recognition of, and some kind of accountability towards the local church, although that might differ in a range of ways.
And
That being said, because of the universal church again, the local church isn't supreme totally, right? In the sense that it's still a divine human institution just for this age, and it will fade away before the universal church. And so that belief in the universal church kind of weakens the significance of the local church to some extent. Right. It's a limited human expression of a greater reality.
So do you think there's a particular danger then for someone to ascribe to the universal church saying, I belong to the universal church, I just don't see the need of being part of a local church?
Absolutely a danger. Yeah. And so it's this kind of overly simplistic approach to theology, isn't it? Where it's like, yes, the universal church is more important, That doesn't mean it's the only thing, because God, the head of the universal church, has resolved and decreed to express the universal church in time and space in formal communities of believers. So you can't just state one truth the exclusion of the other truths. So yeah, you're right. A total danger, total misunderstanding of the whole counsel of God at that point.
Yeah, very good. And then in terms of support, or what does it look like to support gospel growth outside of the church? So how do we support parachurches in the definition that you've outlined outside? What does that look like?
The subtitle of the book, The Vine Movement, is something along the lines of supporting gospel growth beyond your church. And it, in that kind of line, it captures the idea. The name The Vine Movement builds off an earlier book that Matthias Media released, written by Colin Marshall and Tony Payne, called Trellis and the Vine, which talks a lot about how, yes, there are the good trellises that are there to facilitate the growth of the church, but there is a spiritual life, the vine itself, that always goes beyond, and the vine grows over your property's boundary and into the neighbours and so on and so forth. And so there's and so for that reason, it's helpful to realise that on a conviction level, Jesus is raised on high. He rules the whole world. The whole world is his, and he's poured out his Spirit on all of us. We are all prophets, priests, and kings. And we are all, wherever we go, whatever we do, we're living in him, worshipping him with our whole life. And any of us can speak the word of God wherever we find ourselves to whoever we meet. And so that universal church mindset, I think, ought to have an expression in the way we lead our local communities. That you talked about the person who said, I belong to the universal church, therefore I don't need to have a home church, local church. The opposite could be said. A group of elders or a bishop could say, I lead this local church or this denomination, therefore I have no need or no regard for anything outside of us. It's the opposite error, right? It's so overemphasizing the institutional church on earth that it misses the fact that it goes beyond that. And even in Acts, we see that, the apostles are involved in councils and ordaining and so on and so forth. But the gospel reached Antioch because people were scattered and end up there and began preaching, and people got converted, including those who weren't circumcised Jews. And it just happened by the Spirit through his people. And then the apostles, after the fact, sent Paul and Barnabas, this is in Acts 11, go and see what's going on, positively celebrate and recognize it as legitimate, and to report back, and so it can happen the other way around, where the gospel spreads before our synod, or our classes or whatever it is gets up to it. And we shouldn't resent that. We should go, that also reflects our doctrinal belief in the one holy Catholic apostolic church that's universal, that's Christ at the head of. Yeah. And then in practice, pray for, support, look for ways to encourage, call to account when it's needed, be willing to share resources, including members and people and leaders and money and facilities. All those things can flow out of that on a case-by-case basis. Yeah,
very good. So you've obviously have a lot of experience in church planting and missions and ministry. What's a particular challenge that you found within what you're talking about, the church and the parachurch or gospel growth outside of the church? What's a particular challenge that you found churches facing with that in our cultural context?
Oh, you like to sharpen the question for me, Caleb.
Sorry. I was sort of just trying to process a thought at the same time. What's a particular a challenge that you found that churches face with trying to support gospel growth outside of their walls?
Gotcha. I think one of the basic ones is just communication. It's there's a great paper that was written by the Lausanne Conference for World Evangelization about operating together between mission societies and churches and so on. And one of their findings, they said, we were even embarrassed just, but the more we interviewed people, the more we researched, we felt a bit sheepish that the advice we kept coming up with was just talk to one another. Yeah. It just seemed too simple, seemed too obvious, but that was the big headline motif. And yeah, that's where so much falls down, that trust, treading on each other's toes, unnecessary duplication, poorly managing church discipline, all these kinds of things come just by not proactively communicating. So if there was a single thing, I would say, and look, because we're bombarded with social media and emails and junk mail, including Christian junk mail, and because we're so information saturated, it can be easy to just be reactive and just get on with your own thing. But I think in the midst of information, the way you manage information saturation is not by trying to do everything, nor is it by ignoring everything as if you can, and just sort of shutting your ears and just doing that. Definitely it shouldn't be merely reactive, just doing the thing that shouts the loudest and pings the most often. Instead, what you need to do is take proactive steps around priority and say, what matters to me? How am I going to make sure that I make time for what matters to me? Now, one of the big parts of making time for something is usually some degree of proactive attentiveness and communication. But yeah, I can't communicate with every single mission society, every single local parachurch in Perth or Hobart or whatever. But I can say, what are the ones that my members are involved in and that our church is committed to philosophically? When they communicate with me, I make sure I find some time to read their communications. If they have events, I plug them into my calendar and our church's calendar. If our members are involved, I want to make sure I know who's involved and how, what for, and that and so on. Do you know what I mean? So it's actually a thing to say, amongst all the noise, this matters. Which ones matter, and what are the things I'm going to do to own that proactively? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I like that. And it sort of alludes to that, that desire for there to be a unity around churches as well, to be not so focused on a singular vision, but almost what you're saying, you can't simplify it by just saying the universal church and the local church, but then there's this element of how do we work together in the areas or the regions that we find ourselves to further the gospel message.
That's right.
And so that's being a challenge. What's been something that's been like really successful or encouraging in your time doing this research?
It would drill home the point, wouldn't it, if I said proactive communication? But hey, you know what? It is. Like when people look, here's a simple thing, right? If you're got missionaries, link missionaries with your church, that's a kind of parachurch ministry, cross-cultural mission. And if you actually communicate with them regularly, tell them that you're praying for them, respond to their prayer newsletters, when they come back on furlough or leave, you take initiative as well in helping organise their time, so they're not having to become project managers for their, home assignment. All these kinds of things. If you take ownership in that process, if there's an appeal from their mission society for a building project for their training college, if you own that appeal and say, hey, our church is going to do a fundraiser barbecue to help towards that, it's so encouraging. It just helps the person feel like you're not just a photo on a notice board or a line item in the budget, but that you're actually partners together. So communication, there you go. Like it really is enormously encouraging. If you get pastors contact, say, a local campus ministry and say, hey, when are the dates for your key conferences? We don't want to accidentally, thoughtlessly double book, so people have to choose.
Right.
Give us your calendar in advance. We'll plug into our calendar and avoid clashes. And we'll promote your key conferences, even within our... Or it's so simple when you say it, isn't it, those things?
It sounds super simple, yeah.
But the scandal is those things often don't happen. And so that saying, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king.
Yeah.
It's a bit like that. When most churches, even the ones that give money to mission or to parachurch work, don't really do anything else beyond that, and even might cancel their donations with nothing more than a 2-line email from the treasurer. When that's the default, double book things without thinking, so on. When you get the person who's proactive on those things, it is encouraging. It makes life easier. It makes the work more efficient. All these kinds of things. It's really awesome. So there you go. It's so simple, but the power of that stuff in practice, talking together about an overstretched potential volunteer and a pastoral concern with that. If churches and parachurches communicate on that and love the volunteers, rather than it being a tug of war of who can get the most man hours out of our keen Christians, by pastoring them, we avoid using our keen people. We show that we're on the same page. Yeah, all that kind of stuff. Right.
Yeah. Do you think there's a link in what you're saying to that idea of burnout in ministry?
Yeah. I both in both directions. If these things work well, including having an outlet like running a podcast or helping with a ministry that provides some kind of care for the homeless, or contribution to, that those external to the church outlets can help. Because one of the causes of burnout is feeling like you're not in your sweet spot, that it's a grind. It's just more compliance administration, getting the next sermon done, dealing with complaints and complex pastoral issues. By having these external outlets, it could be refreshing to you if they're managed well, but also, managing, hitting messages and so on. Yeah, just a little bit of skill can simplify our lives and simplify the crazy and simplify the mess of demands in a whole bunch of ways too. I think one of the things that, say, our churches need to do is also just be restrained, stay in our lane. You know how that's a saying now? Just stay in your lane, man. Do the thing you're meant to do and just do that. Often parachurches go, but we could do a spring program. We could do an autumn program. We could do a summer program. We could do a men's thing. We could do a women's thing. We could do a thing for the people who've graduated from our thing, the thing for the people who haven't joined it yet. And it just oozes outwards. Whereas we stay in our lane, then it actually means that, again, lowers the pressures of burnout, because there's a little bit of time to just get home, have a shower, watch some television, do nothing. There's a little, whatever. It does take the load off and simplify. Yeah,
very good. Just moving on to a different sort of thought that I had. I recently read an article that you wrote on the Gospel Coalition, called "If We're Really Being Discipled by the World 24/7, We're Doomed." Do you remember writing that one?
Yeah, sure do. Yep.
Perfect. So in terms of, I thought it provided a really helpful perspective to discipleship in our context, current cultural context, just because we are bombarded with that doom and gloom message that we're in an attention economy, and our attention is constantly being averted away from the gospel. So if we're not in the gospel, we're being shaped and formed by something else. So what's your idea of the world's discipleship versus biblical discipleship?
Yeah, in that article, I was pushing against a well-intentioned, but I think kind of overblown warning or rhetoric that with words like discipleship and idolatry and worship, we can often stretch the metaphor so far. Sports stadiums are temples, shopping centres are temples, whatever it is. Everything becomes worship, and everything's discipleship. But there's that risk that if everything's worship, then kind of nothing's worship. If everything's discipleship, then nothing's. And it creates a doom and gloom, like you said, that's so doomy and gloomy. But if it's true, hence the title of that article, if that is actually the case, then we don't stand a chance. Right. If you really want to say that our media consumption is as much discipleship as our Christian discipleship, we'll never be able to minute for minute, hour for hour, message for message match that. Just,
Right.
yeah, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so if you set yourself up for that, then in a sense, people should stop listening to you after the introduction to your lecture, because it's like,
That's it.
that's it. Unless you're advocating for some kind of monastery or something. And so I think it is helpful to say, yes, there's a kind of discipleship, yes, in the world, the flesh, the devil, the culture. Yes, of course. And there's a kind of worship in that sense. But it's more scattered, less focused, contradictory. If there's idols out there in temples, it's the idols of the many gods of polytheism, not the one God of monotheism, where there's the God of the sea and the God of the market and the God of the road and the God of the widow. They're all competing.
Right.
And so although, yes, we may be getting discipled by the world in a sense, we're getting discipled by multiple worlds, and they're undermining one another as much as they're undermining us. So on the one hand, it's saying that, but on the other hand, it's going, there is a different kind of thing, which is sure, deliberate discipleship and worship. Not the kind of discipleship and the kind of worship that often gets talked about, but the deliberate one. That means, at its best, an hour in church or 10 minutes in the Bible in the morning is just worth more than 3 hours on Netflix or YouTube. This is because I'm on YouTube and it's a cat riding a tortoise and it's Obi-Wan falling forever, and then it's a dude giving me a life hack about how to make smoothies in my coffee machine, and then it's just
Yeah.
10 minutes in the Psalms is going to beat 3 hours of that junk. It just is. Yeah. And so I guess that, in a sense, it's emboldening to go, there is a sense in which, on the one hand, we can't escape all those things. And that's the constant battle in this life. On the other hand, there is a depth and a power in just the basics of Christian disciplines that has cut through, as they say. And you see that in any worldly ideologue as well. The person who has completely gotten on, the non-Christian who's completely gotten on board with a hyper vegan environmentalism. They will absorb that in a way that will enable them to steer through a world of consumerism and individualism and remain quite ideologically committed to their environmental cause. Or the person who's absorbed in intense right-wing nationalism through sort of nutty YouTubers will maintain that despite all the quote-unquote woke messaging that gets thrown at them. If anything, it strengthens them, doesn't it? Every time they see what they would call the woke messaging or the social justice warriors, it actually confirms them in what they believe, which is, I'm not that. And I guess that's what we as Christians can do as well. That's simple Christian parenting thing of talking about the Pixar movie you've watched is doing that, isn't it? It's going, as we watch this, we're not being passive disciples of the world, but we're using it as another discipleship tool for the kingdom.
Very good. Yeah. I read recently the book by James K. Smith called You Are What You Love, and he goes a bit into sort of what you're saying about how the culture creates these different temples, whether it's the mall and the stadiums, and it's these places of worship. But in terms of the point that one of the points that he makes, which I really like, and I think it's in line with what you're saying, he says, discipleship, we might say, is a way to curate your heart, to be attentive to and intentional about what you love. So it's that idea of you can go out into every day and there could be this bombardment from every direction of all these different places of what you could worship. But it's that intentionality of where you place where you direct your desires. That's what's going to make the most impact. So how do you think as Christians then, is there particular spiritual disciplines or practices that we can sort of help frame our lives that are helpful to our own discipleship?
Yeah. I mean, it would be great, wouldn't it, if God had spoken to Christians in as a minority culture in a polytheistic world of competing gods. had written a bunch of letters to small Christian communities in cities, like port towns with, we've got the New Testament that gives just that, don't we? Like that's speaking to those kinds of things. And so we can draw out, again, a lot of it isn't radically new stuff. So one area where I would disagree with, at least what I take to be sort of the emphasis of James K. Smith, is he does a lot of things, because he's correcting against an overly ideas-only view of humanity, and it's only what you believe that does everything. I think, like often people with new ideas, you often overcorrect, and I feel like from memory reading his stuff, I feel like he overcorrects in a way that he almost ends up saying it's not ideas, but the New Testament clearly says it is partly. We are taught in Christ, we're instructed in him, we are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds, that there is a sense in which our minds rule over our passions and shape our lives and our loves. That's certainly one way in which the New Testament does talk, which he might say is whatever it is, enlightenment or modernist or whatever, but I think it's there in the New Testament. There's multiple points where you have that kind of thing. The world is just driven by its passions and its desires. Don't be like them. Instead, have your mind enlightened, and through the enlightenment of the mind by the Word and the Spirit, that will shape your love. So that is one side of it. So reading your Bible and going to church and learning and memorizing Scripture and praying out God's Word. There's that and being discerning. So, not being a passive recipient to the messages of the world, but sifting them. So that's, I feel like James Smith kind of says, it's not so much that, but I want to say that's clearly in the New Testament.
Yeah.
And yet, what he does say is very helpful, which is this other way of talking about, which is the direction of our loves, the orientation of our heart, which actually, whether it's to or against God, will then dictate our thinking, which will then, so it will be, if we're darkened in our desires, we'll think dark thoughts. And if we're Godward in our desires, we'll think Godward thoughts. So that is true as well. And so those things that God gives us in our Christian lives do both instruct us, but also warn us. Preaching, it preaches to the mind and the heart. Gathering as God's people is both gathering to learn, to recite and so on, but it's just being with, isn't it? And it's singing, and it's doing something more than simply merely education in some narrow rain on a stick sort of way. So praying and singing and meeting, all these things are a part of it as well. Remembering, applying our theology right through to the fact that actually every time I see the beautiful world, there's some smells and scents and touch. That's God's world. And that's one of the ways His glory is displayed, recognizing that He's also given us the Lord's Supper as one of the ways His word is spoken to us. All that stuff is true as well. I again push against Smith in the way he seems to want to make more of kind of capital L liturgy and capital S sacrament as somehow the inevitable result of his observation. Right. And at that point, I just feel like he's finding what he wants to find anyway. I think he already likes those things and then says his philosophy requires it. A bunch of people have said, oh, yeah, because of all that stuff, we have to do communion every week. It's a game changer. You can. It's not a game changer. Like it's one way that God's word speaks, whether you do it annually, monthly, quarterly, or weekly. It's not that amazing. Or I guess I could say singing and praying and preaching is as amazing as it is. They're also enfleshed. They also draw in my whole self, including my affections. So I think you can take it into a line where suddenly ancient liturgies, sacraments, silence, fasting, somehow do more. I'm not so convinced that there's some ways to do it. Those things can also be present in other expressions of Christian life and church.
Yeah, definitely. I think we're definitely holistic beings, and we've been created. Like you're saying, we've got different senses and touch and smell and all these different things. Yeah, one of the things I find amazing is just how much discipleship and almost evangelism takes place around the dinner table. So
Yeah.
it's like sharing a meal. And I think it does come down to that, like that's in it being intentional about something. So it's like we get to share this meal together, and who you invite to the table is important. What food you create is part of that. And I think, yeah, we see that in the way Jesus like did his evangelism and his ministry as well, as often around a table or around a meal or something like that, which is, yeah.
There's a fascinating, in preparing the Vine movement, I went on a deep dive into various things, including the Salvation Army and its history. And it was very hyper-spiritual in shedding the sacraments and saying, no, the sacrament is Christian life itself, and therefore you don't need, that was partly to do with resisting alcohol amongst, because of their ministry amongst the homeless and where alcohol is a big issue. But it was also this spiritual revivalism that said, it's the consecrated heart. But all the historians and theologians of salvationism point out how those things all got replaced. Now you chuck out the hymns and the organs, and suddenly you've got the brass band, and you get rid of the sacraments, and then you have this laying upon the altar and various other practices that became part of salvationism that almost became like new sacraments that were made up by booths, but functionally did the same thing. That's quite interesting. We go, because we're embodied, we'll end up with those things, even if we don't. Even like the apparently brain-only simplistic meeting halls of low church, non-conformity. There's a certain beauty to them, Like I think about like the kind of like that Puritan style of painting and clothing, and on one level they're fancying themselves as not caring about the world, but gosh, they do it with great attention to craft. And color, and there's a loving beauty and frugality as well. That we're not Anglicans, we're not all pompous and worldly. But you found your own way to actually, in a more gritty, down to earth, low church way, capture a magic. And there is a magic in those old gospel halls that are super simple, but still have a certain beauty to them.
Yeah, brilliant. A couple of last thoughts, that I'd love to get from you is, while you're researching your recent book, The Vine Movement, was there any particular bit of research that you came from that, like, you were very surprised by, or, overwhelmed or pleasantly distracted by?
Oh gosh, so many. It's hard to pinpoint. I mean, there was just a lot of me wondering and going, so how did that work? How did the whole Methodism and Anglicanism thing work? And
going down
chasing that through. How did the religious orders relate to the Catholic Church? And sometimes people portray it as if the Catholic Church have this parachurch thing nailed. They have religious orders, and the Protestants don't. But actually, the whole history of the medieval church and before was the same wrestles between church and parachurch. It was just between church hierarchy and religious orders. That's the same thing, the rise and fall, sometimes collaboration, sometimes one quashed the other or another ran ahead of the other. Right. So there's a lot of just that discovering. I mean, a book that I loved, and maybe I could recommend this just because it's interesting. You can find it secondhand, I think still on like Amazon, and you'll maybe in some of your libraries. John Smith, who's helped start the God Squad in Australia, he did a PhD on the Jesus movement, which is kind of the whole hippies becoming Christians and cross-cultural evangelism in this counterculture, and how that then actually led into, amongst other things, house church movement, the mega church movement, Christian music, modern contemporary Christian music. It's a fascinating read. Oh my goodness. So Evan John Smith, The Jesus Movement, Origin, something and something. And it's a really interesting read. So that was a highlight. Just, he'd done it in an anthropological study sort of way, so heaps of interviews, and looking at an example of relatively recent and extremely entrepreneurial and spirit filled, as well as bizarre and eccentric and crazy, expressions of mission in the late 20th century. So that was a great I stumbled across that in like a church, a Brethren church's library. How sometimes churches have like a library. Yeah. And it's awesome. So yeah, John Smith ended up being one of the people I dedicated the book to. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, very cool. And then finally, just in closing, I want to read a quote to you, and just get your thoughts on it. It's by a man named Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. I probably butchered that pronunciation. But it goes like this: if you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood, and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea.
Yeah, that's vision is a great mobilizer rather than mere jobs or mere duty even, or the sort of guilt-inducing talk of needs. Yeah, I think that's very true. I think it's true with fundraising. If you're trying to raise money for something, if you just say, we're $10,000 short, we need to get that, or we won't make budget, you can occasionally do that. But if instead you say, hey, here's the good work we're doing, would you come and join with us in making it happen? You can be a part of it. As a default way of fundraising, that's a far better way to do it, I think. And yes, so also recruiting, whether it's for mission or even for a roster in church, rather than just going, we need 2 more kids workers or something like that, to say, hey, here's how this ministry relates to the ministry of our church. Here's the part it plays. Here's the kind of person that, God uses in this kind of work. Are you that person? Could you help be a part in this? Yeah, absolutely. It's a great little line. He's the guy who wrote the Little Prince, hey?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. It's been great chatting. Before we go, if people want to find out more about you or want to grab a copy of your book or one of your 2 books, where would you direct them to?
So you can find me on Twitter, Mikey_G_Lynch. And on Facebook, I have a more or less defunct blog whose Facebook page is still pretty active. Christian Reflections. I think it's like XIAN Reflections or something like that on Facebook. And so I'm active in both those places. I write regularly as well as edit other people's stuff for the Gospel Coalition Australia. So you can find me there. With the book, buy it from Matthias Media or any kind of local independent Christian bookshop would be good to back. It's also available on a whole bunch of the audiobook platforms, so you can get it through your Audible or Spotify or Google Books, Google Play, whatever. And that the audiobook version also includes a couple of chapters that weren't put into the print edition. Those chapters bonus chapters. You can also get those off the Matthias Media website though. So if you went to Divine Movement on Matthias Media's website, there's a drop down that has those 2 chapters as PDFs. And I think the book itself has the URLs for them, for those chapters, if you know what I mean. So, so ebook, paperbook, audiobook, it's available across all of those. And the same with The Good Life in the Last Days. And I narrated both the books, so you can get to listen to my lovely voice, read it out. And so, same with Good Life in the Last Days. It's also available on some audiobook forms, maybe a few less. You might have to do a bit more hunting there. I'm definitely on Audible and Christian Audio. And Matthias Media.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks so much for making the time to have this conversation, Mikey. Really appreciated it and enjoyed it. You've clearly done a lot of thinking in that missional ministry and church planting space, and I think it's been I've enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully you have as well.
Yeah, I have. Thanks, Caleb. Cheers, mate.
No worries. Cheers.